Let's go to the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah, chapter 2 is where we're going to hang out this morning. We started this series at the beginning of the year, and we're just going through the book of Nehemiah. We're just making our way through it. We're navigating our way through it. And so I encourage you, if you've missed any of the previous weeks, please go back and watch those messages. Just so you can get up to speed with where we're at. But if this is your first Sunday with us here, or your first time hearing or jumping into this series, I'll fill you in a little bit as to what's going on so you're not lost on where we're at if you're not familiar with the book of Nehemiah. But Nehemiah chapter 2 is where we're going to be. As I look around the room today, and I say this pretty frequently, and it blesses my heart when I look around our sanctuary and I see people that come from different backgrounds, people that come from different upbringings, people that have different stories. It's pretty obvious here, especially when you have different ethnicities, different ways that they were brought up, different things that they were exposed to as children, different ways that they were raised by their parents. Even where you may be at currently, it's different. We all have different stories. We all have different places that we're at right now, but doesn't matter where you're living, it doesn't matter where you're working, wherever you find yourself today, and as different as that may be, there's one thing that we all have in common. The one thing that we all have in common is that because of Jesus, we're all on this journey with the Lord. We're all on this journey with God. And what that means is that we've got to see that God has put us wherever we are at this moment, wherever you may find yourself at this moment. He has put us there for a reason. He has put us there for a very specific purpose. And once you start to see that, once you start to believe that and come to that realization, it should change your outlook on how you view the situation. It should change your outlook on how you feel about being there. Because for some of you, you may not like where you're currently at. Some of you may not like where your current situation has you. You may not like where you work at. You may not like how your family situation is right now. You may not like the current state that you may be in. But whether you don't like being there or whether you love being where you're at, no matter how you feel about it, we can't forget that God has you there for a purpose. You can't forget that God has you there for a purpose. His purpose. His purpose. And so the question now that you have to ask yourself is, do you trust God? Do you trust God? Do you trust His purpose? Do you trust His purpose where your current situation is? Even though you don't like it, even though you may want it to change, do you trust His purpose? And this is what brings us to Nehemiah, because Nehemiah was in a place where he was born into captivity in Persia, and he was in a place where he recognized that his people were living in captivity because of a consequence of their sin. But through God's intervention, through God's means, he releases his people. The Persians release the Israelites to return back to their homeland. But as I said in previous weeks, when they return back to their homeland, they don't return back to the same type of home. In fact, what they return back to is something that is that of destruction, that of ruins. And so Nehemiah gets this report of his people. And Nehemiah is currently serving as a cupbearer to the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. He's serving as a role of the cupbearer. And though Nehemiah receives this news of his people, he realizes in the moment that something had to be done. Because the Bible tells us when he hears of the condition of his people, that immediately he grieves and he mourns and he's moved with compassion for his people. And he begins to pray and to fast for them. And so he knows something has to be done. And what we're going to see throughout this book is that God is going to use Nehemiah. He's going to use him to rebuild the city. He's going to use him to rebuild his people. And then because of his trust in God, because of his trust that God is going to do something, we're going to see where he's going to leverage his position as the cupbearer to fulfill God's purpose, to fulfill God's plans. And we're going to see what it looks like to trust God. We're going to see what it looks like to trust God in your current situation, in your current environment, wherever God has you. And so let's look at the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2. We'll begin reading at verse 1. The book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verse 1 begins this way. It says, during the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now let's stop right there for a moment because I got to highlight something here that I think is very interesting. Verse 1 tells us that this is during the month of Nisan, which means that from the moment Nehemiah heard the report of his people, when he heard that his people were living in a city with broken walls and burned gates, when he learned the distress that his people were living under, which caused him to grieve and mourn and to pray, from that moment until this moment now, the month of Nisan, was a period of about 4 months. 4 months had gone by, which I think it reveals something interesting about Nehemiah. It reveals that Nehemiah did not just jump and react in a moment of his emotion. He didn't just jump and act in a moment of his emotion. Rather, Nehemiah waited patiently. He waited. And I don't think it's a stretch to say this, but that while he was waiting, he was also praying. Nehemiah was trusting that, yes, I know God is going to do something, but he's also trusting in God's timing. He's trusting, he's waiting, he's praying, and this period was about 4 months. Which brings me to my first point this morning. If you're taking notes, I encourage you to write this down. What does it look like to trust God? Number one, we must be patient. We must be patient. Now, I've got to be honest with you. I've been guilty of being impatient with God's timing. I've been guilty of being impatient with God's timing, and we can probably all identify moments in our lives where we've acted impatiently, where we felt like God was taking too long. Anybody else other than me ever been in that situation? You just feel like God's taking too long. You're like, come on, God. Something's got to give. Something's got to change. Time's are wasting. God, I need you to do something. I need you to come through for me. Yeah, that's just an honest position that I've been in before. I've been guilty of being impatient with God's timing. But what Nehemiah was showing us in this moment was he was displaying for us what it looks like to trust God and what it looks like to trust his timing, what it looks like to be patient in the Lord. But let's continue in verse 1. He says, so I took the wine and I gave it to the king. And I had never been sad in his presence. And so the king said to me, why do you look so sad when you aren't sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. I was overwhelmed with fear. I was overwhelmed with fear. See, part of Nehemiah's job as a cupbearer to the king, not only was he a food taster for the king, where he tasted the wine and the food before it was served to the king to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. Not only was he in a leadership role in this position as the cupbearer, but also one of his responsibilities as the cupbearer was to also cheer up the king. In other words, the king does not want you around if you're going to bring any of your sad, negative energy. The king doesn't want that type of stuff. And so to have a position of a servant to the king, it's a pretty big position. It's a position that you don't just take lightly. In fact, historically, get this, this is very interesting. Historically, it tells us and it shows us that whenever servants would approach the king, that they would always approach the king with the hand shielding their mouths. And they did this because they didn't want to offend the king with their bad breath. True story. That's factual. They would approach the king with their right hand, shielding their mouth so they would not offend the king with their bad breath. I mean, think about that for a moment. It is possible that you could offend the king with your bad breath and he would have you executed for it. Some of you are thinking of folks right now that probably wouldn't last 10 seconds. Like, yeah, he wouldn't make it. She wouldn't make it. And if they're sitting next to you, don't nudge them. Don't nudge them. Just hand them some gum. But you can offend the king with your bad breath. So it shows the depth and it shows the weight of this responsibility. It shows the weight of this position that Nehemiah had with the king as the cupbearer. And if my responsibility was to cheer up the king, if my responsibility was to bring joy and cheer to the king, then you can't approach the throne room sad. You can't approach the throne. You can't approach the king sad because you run the risk of offending the king with your mood, with your sadness. And if you offend the king, there's a possibility you could be killed. You could have your head chopped off. And so it's no question that Nehemiah says in his own words, I was overwhelmed with fear. He was probably like, uh-oh, my countenance is not looking good. And the king took notice of his sadness. The king took notice of his mood and his disposition. And thus he was afraid. Nehemiah was scared in that moment. Which I think it also tells us and reveals to us as well that it is possible to walk with God and still be afraid. That's just a point of our humanity that we've got to deal with. But let's look at Nehemiah's response to the king. Verse 3, and this is his reply to the king. May the king live forever. Why should I not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? We can't overlook the fact, too, that Nehemiah was using his words very carefully and very wisely in this moment. Notice he began by showing the king respect. May the king live forever. In other words, to soften him up a little bit, to show that, hey, I'm not here to disrespect you in any way. But though Nehemiah was being very careful and being wise with his words, it didn't stop Nehemiah from being direct. It didn't stop him from being direct in what he needed to say to the king in this moment. Nehemiah doesn't want to avoid this hard conversation. Nehemiah does not want to avoid this interaction, which brings me to my second point this morning, that a person that trusts God is a bold person. It's a bold person. We must be bold when we trust the Lord. We must be bold when we trust God. Because listen to how he answers the king. Listen, he already said he was afraid. But he musters up enough boldness to go ahead and make his response to the king. And he says, I'm sad because the city where my ancestors are buried, it lies in ruins. Notice that he left out the name Jerusalem. Notice that he left out the name of the Israelites. Why? Because he knew the king wouldn't care about that. The king had no connection with that. The king could care less that Jerusalem was known as the city of God. He didn't care about none of that. But look at what he does do. Nehemiah gets the king to think about and imagine, well, what if the place where your ancestors were buried was destroyed? What if the place where your ancestors buried was left in ruins? And what he's doing here, and using in all wisdom, he wanted the king to connect emotionally with this situation. He wanted to find a common ground with the king. That's pretty wise. It's a lot of wisdom there. And I would say that in the same way for us as believers, as followers of Jesus, when it comes to engaging the world, or when it comes to engaging lost people, one of the ways to build relationships and one of the ways to really build bridges is to find common ground with people. To find common ground with non-believers if we're ever going to engage with people. Because we don't always have to do big dramatic things to reach lost people. It doesn't always have to go that way. Sometimes it's just using wisdom in very simple conversations. Sometimes it's just using wisdom and finding common ground with lost people, being mindful of where they're at, being mindful of their context, finding common ground with them. Some of the relationships that I have in my own life with people who are not followers of Jesus, oftentimes those relations are built off the common ground. And what it does is it allows me to see into their world, and they also get to see into mine. Finding a common ground. Finding something that we can relate to. And we see Nehemiah in wisdom. This is what he's doing with the king. He's getting the king to connect with his story. He's getting the king to connect with this bad situation. And I believe this is what Paul is referring to in the book of Colossians chapter 4, verse 5. This is what Paul says. He says, act wisely towards outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. And this is what Nehemiah does with the king. This is his dealing with the king. He's dealing with Artaxerxes in a very wise and a very gracious way. And he uses this opportunity. He takes advantage of this opportunity in a very incredible way. Sadly, for many of us as followers of Jesus, as Christians, I think many times we've seen opportunities ruined. That's because in our engagement with lost people, we didn't speak graciously to them. We didn't speak wisely to them. And sometimes those bridges between the lost, those bridges between unbelievers sometimes gets burned because we don't use wisdom. So if we're going to trust God, we've got to be bold, but we've got to be bold with wisdom. We've got to be wise in our engagement with outsiders. We've got to be wise with our engagement with those who aren't followers of Jesus. And so he engages with the king in this way. He makes a connection with the king. He uses wise words and very gracious words. And let's look at the result of this. Let's look at the king's response in verse 4. He says, then the king asked me, well, what is your request? So I prayed to the God of the heavens and answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah and to the city where my ancestors are buried so that I may rebuild it. I love that even in this text, we see Nehemiah still praying. Nehemiah is still praying. Even in the middle of this conversation, he's praying. The king asked him a question. Then it says, I prayed to the God of the heavens. It was probably a very quick, under his breath type of prayer. Those really short, quick prayers, which, you know, if you've ever had hard conversations with people, and sometimes I've been in situations where I'm in some hard conversations and hard connection with people, and while they're talking, I'm praying. I'm like, God, please help me in this conversation. God, please help me have the right words to say. Please help me be wise here. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in those situations before, but those real quick prayers where you're just asking the Lord for his help. You're asking the Lord to intervene. That's what's happening in this moment. Nehemiah is recognizing the weight of this situation. And so the king's like, what do you want? And Nehemiah is like, oh God, help me say the right thing. Help me say the right thing. Which also shows us, point number 3, write this down, that in trusting God, we must continue to pray. We don't just pray one time and just move on. No, we have a lifestyle of prayer. We continue to pray. That's a sign of us trusting God. We don't stop praying. We continue in our conversation. We continue in our communication with the Lord. See, Nehemiah, he knew he was standing before somebody important. He knew that. He knew he was standing before someone that could take his life if he got offended. He recognized that. He was standing before a king. But here's something Nehemiah also knew. He knew that there was a king far greater. Nehemiah knew that there was a king far more powerful, far more superior than Artaxerxes could ever be. So the next time you may be in a situation where maybe you're facing someone that maybe makes you feel intimidated, just stop and recognize for a moment that you serve a God that is far greater and far more powerful than they could ever be. Which means you don't have to be intimidated by another man or another woman ever, because you serve a God that is far more superior. And Nehemiah knew that. Nehemiah recognized that. Yeah, I'm standing before a very powerful, influential person, but man, my God is far greater than he is. That's why he cried out to him. That's why he prayed to him, because he knew. We don't stop praying. Why? Because we know who we're praying to. We know who our God is. And so Nehemiah, he gives the king his purpose. He gives the king his reasoning. He said, let me leave so I can go rebuild my people's city. Let me leave so I can go serve and rebuild my people. Let me leave so I can go help them. And let's continue, verse 6. So the king with the queen seated beside him asked me, well, how long will your journey take? And when will you return? So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. Whew. What a sign of relief, right? What a sign of relief. Most of us would have probably quit right there. We quit while we're ahead. I got what I came for. I'm good. Let me just back out before he changes his mind. But now Nehemiah doesn't stop there. Nehemiah continues, verse 7. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters written to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates River, so that they will grant me safe passage until I reach Judah. And let me have a letter written to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to rebuild the gates of the temple's fortress, the city wall, and the home where I will live. The king granted my requests, for the gracious hand of my God was on me. Let's talk about this for a moment. Nehemiah, he's asking for time off to go rebuild a city that the king did not care about. Not only that, but I also need a reference letter from you, king. I also need a reference letter from you that gives me safe passage, that makes me untouchable as I make my journey. Oh, but wait, not only that, king, let Asaph know that I'm going to need timber. I'm going to need wood to rebuild the gates. Oh, and also to rebuild my house. So in other words, he's saying, I need time off, and I need you to finance this entire project. That's crazy. That's crazy. But what this shows us is that people who trust God, point number 4, write this down, they also move in faith. People that trust God, we move in faith. Well, what does that mean? Notice that Nehemiah already had a plan. Nehemiah already had this worked out in his head. He didn't just wait and do nothing for those 4 months. Yes, he was praying. Yes, he was seeking God. But he was making his plans. He was making his plans. Unfortunately, sometimes we can be guilty of doing the opposite. Sometimes we can be guilty of saying, hey, I'm just going to be here. I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to trust God, and I believe he's going to do something. But in the meantime, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just trusting in faith that God is going to do something, but let me just sit here and wait. No, that's laziness. That's laziness. Nehemiah, instead, what he was doing while he was fasting, while he was praying, while he was seeking God, he was preparing himself for his encounter with the king. He was preparing himself. He didn't want to show up to the king unprepared. He didn't want to show up to the king unprepared. He wanted to show up. If he showed up that way, he would have looked foolish. Imagine if the king had asked him, well, what is your request? And Nehemiah was like, well, I'm just trusting and believing God. He's going to do something. I don't really know what it is that I want to do, but I need you to let me go and go serve my people. Well, what's that look like? I haven't really quite figured that out yet. I'm just trusting God. Nehemiah would probably say, man, get out of here, man. You don't even know what you're talking about. Why would you ask me such a thing? But no, Nehemiah was prepared. Why? Because he planned. It's not unspiritual to be organized. It's not unspiritual to plan. It's not unspiritual to have a calendar. It's not unspiritual to be on top of your game. And Nehemiah was on top of his game. He didn't want to look foolish before the king. But get this, even in all of his planning and all of his preparing and the king granting his request, he doesn't take the credit. He doesn't take the credit. And instead he says, the king granted my request because I was just so organized. I just had it all together. No, the king granted my request. Why? For the gracious hand of my God was on me. The gracious hand of my God was on me. That's God working in the background. See, in the book of Nehemiah, we won't see or hear about God speaking from the heavens. We won't even see these crazy, wild, miraculous, supernatural miracles. We won't see any of that in Nehemiah. But yet God is still deeply active in this situation. God is still moving in this situation. And see, part of trusting God is believing that God's hand is on your life. Part of trusting God is believing that God is still moving even though I don't see anything happening. I don't see any miracles happening. I don't see any immediate change happening. But God's hand is on me. And I'm trusting and believing that God is actively moving and he's working things out in the background. We even sing it in the song, right? Even when I don't see it, you're working. I don't see positivity in my job right now. I don't see positivity or anything good happening on the workforce. I don't see anything positively happening in my family. I don't see that yet, but God, I'm trusting you're working. I'm trusting your hand is on my life. I'm trusting I'm here in this place, in this specific time for a specific reason. I'm trusting. I'm believing. Let's continue, verse 9. And so now Nehemiah, he's made his request to the king. The king has granted him these requests. Verse 9, he says, I went to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates, and I gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent officers of the infantry and cavalry with me. Oh yeah, I got to mention here too, the king also sent him with a security detail. The king sent him with an army. The king gave him even above and beyond what he had even requested. I just don't want you to miss that. God's hand on the life of Nehemiah. God's favor on his life. Verse 10. When Sanballat and the Horonite and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard that someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. So now we're introduced to these two leaders over these regions that Nehemiah will be passing through. And so far as we know it now, Nehemiah has been passing through with no issues. Everything's been good. But all of a sudden now we're introduced to these two guys, Sanballat and Tobiah. And they appear to be feeling threatened by Nehemiah. And they're threatened by what he is planning to do. Which leads me to my fifth point, so write this down. Trusting God always comes with opposition. Trusting God always comes with opposition, which means we must prepare for opposition. We must prepare for opposition. Nehemiah knew there's a possibility some opposition may be coming. So before I leave, King, I need you to give me a letter that shows that I'm untouchable. I need you to make me a reference letter that shows that they can't mess with me on this journey. That was a preparation for opposition. And for those of us who trust God, for those of us that are putting our faith in God, we must always prepare for opposition. There are always going to be people, and there are always going to be spiritual forces that do not want you to trust in God. Always. Let alone do things for God. Let alone live for God. You're always going to have opposition. You're always going to have these people. You're always going to have these voices. You're always going to have these situations that are going to do everything they can to keep you from trusting and living for God. That's why Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke 14, when talking about following him, he tells them, hey, before you follow me, you better count the cost. You better count the cost of what it's going to entail for you following me. Peter also tells us in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, he says this, dear friends, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes among you to test you, as if something unusual were happening to you. What is he saying? Man, following Jesus, living for the Lord, it's not always going to be a smooth ride. It's not always going to be a smooth ride. There will be enemies, there will be a testing, there will also be a cost to this. There will be opposition. And as people of faith, we've got to prepare for opposition. We've got to prepare for what may come against us for trusting and living for God. I think that's the downfall of a lot of people's walk with the Lord, is they're not prepared for the opposition. And I think for us as leaders within the house, I think we've got to do a better job at communicating the cost of following Jesus. See, some of us have left that part out of the salvation call because we just want people to get saved. Get saved, get saved, get saved. And so we want to say, hey, 50 people got saved today. 100 people got saved today. We want to say those things because it looks good and it looks big on the outset. But if we were to really lay it out for everybody and say, hey, we all need salvation. We all need to follow Jesus. But let me warn you, following Jesus will not be easy. Let me warn you, there will be a cost to following Jesus. Let me warn you, there will be a cost for putting your trust and putting your life in God. There's a cost to these things. It's not going to be easy. And what happens for a lot of people is they're not familiar with that warning. They don't know that it's not going to be easy. And so they start following Jesus and living for Jesus, and then opposition comes. And then the enemy comes. And then life trials comes, and then situations come, and you're just like, well, wait a second. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I thought serving Jesus was going to be better. I thought serving Jesus was going to be easy. It will be better. But the Bible never says it's going to be easy. That's why Peter said, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes. Don't be surprised when opposition comes. Don't be surprised when trials come. Don't treat it like this is something unusual. Don't treat it like, man, I didn't expect this to happen. No, he says expect it. Expect opposition. Prepare for opposition. How do you prepare for opposition? Well, I think one of the best ways to do that is to start your day off in the Lord. Start your day off in prayer. I always pray. One of the things I always say verbatim every single day, Lord, prepare me for whatever's ahead today. Lord, prepare me for whatever I'm going to face today. Just prepare me. I don't know what it is. It may be nothing. I may not walk through anything today. Today may be a smooth day. I don't know about you, I like smooth days. I like days where there's no opposition. It may be one day, it may be 2 days. You know what? Sometimes it's even been a week. But some days, like we all know, Some days it feels like one thing after another, after another, after another. There's always going to be opposition against you when you put your trust and your hope and your faith in God. Always. The question is, do you trust that his hand is on you? Do you trust that he's walking with you? Do you trust that he's leading you? Don't act as if something unusual were happening to you. This is all a part of what this is. Count the cost. And that's what Nehemiah did when he made his request to the king. Let's continue reading verse 11. He says, after I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there for 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. So now Nehemiah, he's finally arrived. He's made it on his journey. He's now arrived in Jerusalem. But as we'll see in verses 13 through 15, he didn't give the people his plan yet. He didn't just go into the city and say, hey, here's what I'm going to do, guys. I'm here. Everything's going to be better now. No. What we see in verses 13 through 15 is he goes around and he inspects everything. He wants to see the damage for himself. He wants to see the ruins for himself. And again, this is Nehemiah just being patient and being wise. Using wisdom before he says anything. Using wisdom before he gives everybody the plan and everybody the details. I'm not going to read through 13 through 15 just for the sake of time, but he goes through and he inspects. And let's continue reading let's jump down to verse 17. After he's made his inspection, after he's looked at the damage, after he's surveyed all the stuff that needs to be done. This is what he says in verse 17. So I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace. I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. And they said, let's start rebuilding. And their hands were strengthened to do this good work. I love that Nehemiah got in the trenches with his people. Don't overlook this part. He got in the trenches with his people. He didn't say, man, you guys got it bad. Man, you guys are in some trouble. Man, you guys look horrible. Man, you guys are in a predicament. I don't know how you're going to get out of this. No. He says, you see the trouble we are in? You see the trouble we are in? I'm in this with you. You are not alone. You are no longer by yourselves. I'm in this with you. I am in the trenches with you. And then he told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me. He began to tell them the stories. He began to tell them about the conversation he had with the king. And how God's hand was on his life. And what happened in that moment? Well, what we see here is that it encouraged and it moved the people. It built them up. It began to lift them up. And what did they say? Well, let's start rebuilding. Let's do this. And it says their hands were strengthened to do the work. Which leads me to my last and final point here is that people that trust God encourage others to do the same. People that trust God encourage others to do the same. We must encourage others to trust him too. We must encourage others to trust him too. In other words, we can't keep quiet about what God is doing in our lives. That's why I don't believe that our faith is a private faith. It's a pet peeve of mine when I hear people say, well, yeah, I love Jesus, I live for Jesus, but that's just my own personal private faith. I don't really like to share this with anybody else. I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to, make anybody feel uncomfortable. No. As people of God, people that trust God, we need to let it be known who our trust is in. We need to let it be known what God has done for us. We need to let it be known that his hand is on our lives. Why? We saw what happened here. We saw people who were afraid, people who were depressed, people who were down. Listen to the testimony of Nehemiah. Listen to what God has been doing in the life of Nehemiah. And it says, let's do this. Let's rebuild. It says their hands were strengthened. Why? Because they were encouraged. They were encouraged with the testimony of Nehemiah. They were encouraged with the fact of, hey, man, if God's hand is on your life, maybe God's hand can be on my life too. That's why we must encourage others to do the same. We must encourage others to trust God in their lives. Verse 19 says, when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, these guys again, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and despised us. There goes the opposition. The opposition will never stop. And said, what is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Verse 20, listen to this, Nehemiah's response. I gave them this reply. The God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. We, his servants, will start building. But you have no share, right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. In other words, Nehemiah was like, this is none of your business what we're doing here. This is none of your business. You don't have any rights. You know what? Just keep it moving and mind your own business. We're doing the Lord's work. God sent us here. God has ordained us here. God's hand is on us here. You need to just keep it moving. Sometimes that's what you need to tell your opposition. You just need to keep it moving. God has called me here. Man, I'm on a job that I don't like with a lot of opposition. But man, God has called me here. I may not like everything about it. I may not like the entire situation. Man, but God has called me here. All the opposition, all the negativity, all the evil forces, man, just keep it moving. Just keep it moving. Why? We've got work to do. God has me here for a purpose. God has me here for a reason. That's what trusting God looks like. That's what trusting God looks like. Trusting that his hand is on your life. Dennis, you can come on up. We've got to look at the life of Nehemiah from two different perspectives. First, I think we can look at the life of Nehemiah and we can look and say, man, that's the man of faith right there. That's a man who trusts God. Man, he's demonstrating for us what trusting God looks like. He's demonstrating for us what it looks like to really trust that his hand is on your life. Nehemiah was patient. He trusted God's timing. Nehemiah, he prayed. He didn't stop praying to the Lord who knows, the one that gave him favor, the one that's given him authority, the one that's given him strength. Nehemiah was bold. He was bold. Nehemiah moved in faith, trusting that God was going to do something. But while I'm trusting he's going to do something, let me make some plans. Let me do some things. Let me do some action to this faith. It's like for those of you in here this morning that may be believing God for a business, you're believing God to start something new, start something in your life. I hope that you're not just praying and seeking the Lord and just sitting doing nothing. Maybe you should stop and say, you know what? Maybe I need to start making plans. Maybe I need to start preparing. Maybe I need to start writing this down. Maybe I need to start making my preparations and submit that to the Lord. People of faith don't just sit and do nothing. We plan, we prepare, we submit it to the Lord. And people who trust God, they prepare for the opposition. They know that there are going to be people that hate the fact that they're serving the Lord, that hate the fact that you are trusting Him. But when it's all said and done, as people of faith, as people who trust the Lord, we must encourage others to do the same. There are people that need to hear of your faith. There are people that need to see your faith. There are people that need to know that there is hope, that there is life, that there is boldness, that there is confidence you can have in the living God. And that's one perspective that we can look at the life of Nehemiah. God saw the pain and the suffering of his people. And God sends Nehemiah for them. But the same way God saw us, God saw our sin, God saw the pain, God saw the suffering that sin brings to us. And so Jesus is sent for us on our behalf. Nehemiah got in the trenches with his people. Nehemiah goes to rebuild the walls for his people who were hopeless. In the same way, we see Jesus comes and gets in the trenches with us. He gets in the dirt with us. And Jesus, being the perfect builder, comes to build and rebuild our lives that were once broken. Nehemiah gives us an example to look to, but Nehemiah also gives us a sign of the future hope that was to come in Jesus, the perfect builder, the one that's rebuilding our lives that have been broken. And that's why we can trust him this morning. That's why we can put all of our hope, that's why we can put all of our life, all of our trust in him. And so this morning, if you're here today and you say, you know, I'm in a place right now, I'm in a position right now that I don't really like it. I don't like where I'm at right now. I don't like the place I'm at. I don't like the job I'm at. I don't like where my life is right now. Maybe you've got to stop and reevaluate for a moment and think, if I'm on this journey with the Lord and I've put my life in the hands of Jesus, then I've got to trust that God has a purpose for whatever situation or position I may be in right now. And I've got to trust that if I'm here in this environment, if I'm here in this place that I don't really like to be, what if we need to change our perspective for a moment and say, you know what, I'm here in a place I don't like to be, but God, your hand is still on me. What is the purpose you have for me here? What is the purpose you have for me on this job? What is the purpose you have for me in this family environment? What is the purpose for me? You may not see change. You may not see crazy supernatural miracles happening. But it doesn't mean God isn't moving. It doesn't mean God isn't working. It doesn't mean God's hand isn't on your life. This is what it looks like to trust God. This is what it looks like to put everything on him. Everything. And some of you this morning may be having trouble trusting God. Maybe for some of you this morning, your trust has been shot because of the environment you're in or the situation or the position you may be in right now. But what if you need to just stop and come to the realization that, God, your hand is on me. And whatever you want to do in this situation, whatever you want to work out in this environment, whatever you want to work out in this place, God, I am open. I am ready. Why do you have me here? Help me to see. Help me to trust you.